Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here presenting on this topic, psychology of the fish. Can somebody just like ping on the chat just to confirm that you guys can see the deck and hear me speak? Perfect. Thank you. All right. So, so the topic for today is psychology of the fish, leveraging the seven principles of influence. My name is Sourya Biswas, and a bunch of letters after my name show that I'm good at multiple choice exams. uh, in the security domain. Hopefully, that translates into me being a better security consultant because that's what I am. I'm a technical director at NCC Group, perhaps the largest pure play consulting cybersecurity consulting firm in the world. I have around almost 17 years of experience in risk management and infosec, and I've kind of worked on both sides of the table. I mean, as an operator in security teams as well as an advisor to such teams, and my experience has kind of spanned industries and organizations of different cybersecurity maturities. That picture from 2010 is one example where I'm okay with deprecated information. Normally, you don't want old information in matters concerning security. One thing you'll realize is I'm definitely not a psychologist, right? Even though the topic of my presentation says psychology of the fish. That's because I've always been fascinated by the psychological aspects of fishing, and this presentation basically combines lessons from my MBA studies around influence marketing, and with combined with my experience working as an information security professional. So before I go into the psychological elements of phishing, I just want to address why is phishing popular. So here I would like to start off with this quote by Kevin Mitnick, obviously a very well-known person in the infosec industry. And he once mentioned that most of the computer compromises that we hear today use a technique called spear phishing. It's extremely difficult to defend against. So even with a bunch of technologies and tools, people still get phished because it's all about exploiting normal human behavior. So, I mean, if you have an email, and obviously everybody does, you must have received emails like this, right? I mean, very obvious phishing emails, bad English, kind of like some obvious red flags there. But you may also have received emails like this, which are definitely much more sophisticated, right? They do look like as if they're actually appearing from that vendor that is mentioned there, Amazon, right? So, from exotic princes and damsels in distress, right, offering millions of dollars, if you just like pay a few $1,000s in processing costs, right? From that to targeted emails that spoof legitimate email addresses and replicate official templates, phishing emails span a wide maturity spectrum, right? And obviously the numbers are huge. And I actually go back a few years. In 2017, 76% of organizations were targeted by phishing emails. And the same year, around 1.4 million new phishing sites were being created each month. I mentioned the sources here as well. I mean, these are very well-known security providers, Wombat and Webroot. And I also, and obviously, if you work in security, you're familiar with Verizon DBIR, the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, kind of a very authoritative source of cybersecurity statistics. So in 2018, phishing accounted for 32% of data breaches and almost 80% of cyber espionage. And the final data point is actually not from any security vendor. It is actually from federal law enforcement. So the FBI said that in 2019, business email compromise, a specific type of phishing attacks, caused more than $1.7 billion in losses. So obviously, it's a very, very lucrative industry. Lucrative, obviously, I'm, I'm saying that from the perspective of the fishers. So I just want to kind of take a moment to discuss the economics of email fraud. So the idea is that the popularity of phishing is driven not only by its success, but its success relative to its cost. In other words, the time and effort and money that is put in and the the the, the returns from that investment are significantly higher. So it's like if you think of it like any other kind of business, as long as the returns are significantly higher than the investments, this is a practice that will continue and continue to grow. So here are some actual numbers around this, and this actually goes back more than a decade. So in 2008, researchers from UC Berkeley and UC San Diego, they infiltrated the Storm botnet. A botnet, as you know, is like a collection of zombie computers, right, which have been kind of taken over by some external actor and can be used to run these phishing campaigns, spam campaigns, etc. Spam typically is harmless. Phishing actually have like a harmful component to it. So they basically used the Storm botnet to run fake spam campaigns. I mean, pretty much phishing. And they sent 350 emails over 26 days and made 28 sales of approximately $100 each. Right now, on the face of it, this seems to be very poor return on investment. Right, so 28 into 100, that's $2,800 in 26 days. Doesn't seem like much, right? But consider that this particular experiment only used 1.5% of the botnet. So if like 100% of the botnet were used, then that daily revenue would have increased to $7,000 per day. And this is just one botnet and one kind of phishing attack. So in other words, this is a lucrative enterprise and it doesn't cost much. Like with the use of mass emailing tools, right? I mean, that can be used for legitimate purposes, for marketing, for example. And also, people have access to mailing lists, right? Our email addresses are all out there, right? Because, I mean, there are organizations which sell those email addresses, right? And that can be completely legitimate. And sometimes those email addresses are also leaked. Maybe they are present on the dark net and available for pennies each. So because of all these tools and information, it is quite inexpensive to carry out a phishing campaign. In other words, the ROI for the cyber criminal is high. And you can see the reason why phishing is popular, not only because it is easy to do, but also there are legitimate there are not legitimate illegitimate returns which are significantly positive, right, as compared to the time and effort that is put in. Now I'll move on to the 7 principles of influence, and this is where I talk about the psychological elements of phishing. So I want to start off by quoting John Hancock. He was one of the original signatories of the Declaration of Independence. And he mentioned that the greatest ability in business is to get along with others and to influence their actions. And this is true of every human activity, right? Whether you're selling something, right? Convincing others to buy your product or service, or convincing someone to click on a phishing link, it's all about influencing people. And that is why I believe that there is a significant psychological lens that we can look at, like we can look towards phishing from. So I mentioned earlier that I'm not a psychologist, but I'm going to leverage the kind of the learnings from this professor's teachings. And this is somebody whom I encountered during my MBA studies. The particular topic was, I think, called leadership and organizational behavior. So you can see that this person, Dr. Saldini, is kind of the guru of influence marketing, right? He has worked at very well-known universities. He has authored New York Times bestsellers, and he has advised the cream of the Fortune 500. So unlike me, he's definitely a psychologist. Now, moving on to the 7 principles of influence. So these are specific principles that Dr. Saldini discovered and enumerated. And I'm going to first discuss what that principle is all about, and then I'm going to cite an example of how that influence, how that principle of influence is exploited in phishing. So the first one, principle one, reciprocity. And again, this is something that we all know, right? I mean, it's simple give and take. So if you do a favor, you automatically expect that favor to be reciprocated. And there's a nuance to this. So for example, if you want something from somebody, it's always better to kind of do a favor first. So you kind of build up a bank of favors to kind of ask on when the time comes. And there's also an interesting interesting element to this. If you ask somebody for a favor and they refuse it, chances are if you ask for a smaller favor later on, they're going to agree. So this is all, I mean, this is all about like influence marketing, and this is actually legitimately used by marketers. And I'll give you an example. So this is something that Dr. Saldini actually demonstrated. So he sent out Christmas cards to complete strangers, right? People who have never heard of him. And these strangers sent him cards back in return. Also, when people were asked to volunteer, right, for, I mean, they were asked to kind of commit to a particular time, maybe like every week over a year, they were not willing to do so, right? Because it's a pretty long commitment. However, if that request, that original request was followed by another one, which basically said, "Hey, can you just volunteer for a few hours this week or next week?" the chances of success of people actually saying yes increase significantly. It's all about like people refusing a larger favor, but then agreeing to a smaller favor. Now, here is an example of how that is used in phishing. So an email promises to give access to valuable information if you just do something, maybe like download an attachment or click a link. Obviously, these are malicious, right? So an email which says click here to access your new salary after the latest pay revisions, right? In other words, if you do something, you expect to get something, and this is how phishers exploit this principle of influence. I use a lot of these cat memes, so hopefully you enjoy them. So, moving on to the second principle, scarcity. And again, this is something that we kind of intuitively know, right? People want what is difficult to get. So, anything that is kind of rare, that automatically is perceived to be very valuable. And an interesting aspect of this is the fear of losing out is actually more influential than the joy of winning. So it's, I mean, again, these are things that we may have experienced in our daily lives, but Dr. Saldini actually formalized this. So again, an example in real life. So a TV commercial, it advertised a product saying that over 500 sold. In other words, it is very popular, right? But it was actually more successful when it changed the advertising to say only 25 left to sell. In other words, it is scarce. In other words, basically, if you don't order now, there's a chance of losing out. And as I said, the fear of losing out is more influential than the joy of winning. So not only is it scarce, it is also something you can potentially lose out on if you don't act quickly. So again, this TV commercial kind of showed how this particular principle can act in real life. Again, a parallel in phishing. An email stresses that a particular access is available only if a certain action is taken within a short period of time. In other words, again, kind of leveraging this fear of losing out. So if you receive an email which says that install this patch, this MS Outlook patch, otherwise you will lose access to email. So obviously you don't want to, right? You don't want to lose access to email. That is something that you need, right? That you absolutely need for daily work. And this particular email, this phishing tactic actually plays on that fear. And obviously, if you click that link, and that is obviously not a security patch or any upgrades, that's actually malware that you may inadvertently install on your machine. The third principle, authority. People defer to authority, right? Whether it is actual or even assumed. In fact, I've heard this quotation that with a uniform and a clipboard in hand, you can pretty much walk in anywhere. I mean, people are not going to question you, right? Because it seems that you have that authority to be in that place. And again, any claims backed by such leaders are automatically considered as influential. So again, an example in real life. So there was this experiment which was, I think, conducted in Stanford University by Professor Ingram, and this was like done in 1961, early 60s, right? And he demonstrated that people, if they get orders from somebody considered to be influential, those people can act completely against their normal behavior. In this particular case, they were asked to kind of act as prison guards and be cruel to other volunteers acting as prisoners, and they did that, basically behave like that completely contrary to normal behavior. Again, we have actually seen this in wars throughout history, right? I mean, if you think about it, a lot of these wartime atrocities are often committed by the common soldier, but they're often acting on instructions from their superiors. The Holocaust was also an example of that. Normally, people are not that cruel. Again, an example in phishing. So, an email from the CEO, and this is that business email compromise, as I mentioned, it instructs accounts payable to make an unusual payment. So, normally, if an accounts payable receives such a request, they would actually push back, right? Most likely push back. They may ask for additional confirmation. They may actually call up that person to confirm. But just because this email seems to be coming from the CEO, now it can be somebody impersonating the CEO and emailing from a different email account, or it may be someone who has actually compromised the CEO's email account and obviously impersonating that person. But just because that email seems to be coming from the CEO at the very top of the organization, it is less likely for accounts payable, the recipient of the email, to actually push back, even if that request seems to be completely out of the ordinary. So basically, making payment to a vendor at a new account, which in this case is obviously a fraudulent account. It belongs to that criminal, the cyber criminal who actually sent that phishing email. And once those funds are transferred, they're immediately kind of transferred out and very difficult to kind of recapture and basically get back. So again, business email compromise, a particular kind of phishing, which leverages this particular principle of authority. Principle 4, consistency. I mean, everyone is a creature of habit, right? We want to, I mean, if you think about it, the way we do things, they do not really deviate too much from one day to the other in most of our activities. And in other words, I mean, if you make a request, right, which is in tune with how people would normally respond, right? Maybe that is the kind of request that people already see a lot. It is less likely for that person to say yes. And as an example, excuse me, Charlie Trotter's, this is an exclusive Chicago restaurant, and they were facing a lot of problems with no shows, right? So people would call up to reserve tables and they just wouldn't show up. And this is obviously harmful for the restaurant, right? I mean, if a table is reserved, that means that cannot be given to someone else. And also, maybe like if they have walk-in customers, even they cannot access those tables. Excuse me. So again, this was a problem which was really eating into the restaurant's profitability. So what they did was, normally, if somebody would call to make a reservation, the last thing that the person taking the call would say that, yeah, can you please like call up to cancel if your plans change, and that's it. But what they did was they changed the phrasing a bit. So instead of like making a request, they elicited a promise. So basically said that, hey, can you please ensure that you call back, and in case your plans change, can you please ensure that you call back and let us know. So getting that yes response from that customer is basically an implicit promise. And in general, people like to keep their promises. I mean, politicians excluded. But this implied promise was actually helpful. So people, in case their plans actually change, they would now actually call back the restaurant and inform them. So basically, that reservation can be now released for other customers. So again, this is something that is exploited by phishers. And this is when you receive that email, which looks like it comes from a familiar brand. For example, Amazon, right? I mean, pretty much the entire world orders from Amazon. So we are accustomed to receiving emails from Amazon, which says, okay, your order is being shipped, your order is on the way, and stuff like that. Now, the way phishers actually exploit this is when they send out an email which seems to be coming from Amazon, it is less likely for the recipient to look closely. For example, since we pretty much order from Amazon regularly, if we receive an email saying an order is on the way, even if we actually haven't ordered anything, there is a high likelihood that we may not scrutinize it as closely as we should. And obviously, if that email says that, okay, click here to confirm your address or something, that's a phishing link, right? So again, an email which says your Amazon package on the way, click here to confirm your shipping address. This is a very common example of this principle being leveraged by being exploited by phishers. Principle 5, consensus. There is a lot of power in a crowd, right? I mean, people tend to follow the crowd. I mean, if you look at like violent riots or like fans at a rock concert, people tend to kind of follow the crowd. They tend to kind of do exactly what their neighbors and their neighbors are doing. And again, there's something which is used in marketing legitimately. So a TV commercial says operators are standing by, please call. Right? When they have shown you the product, they've shown what the product is capable of, and if you like it, please call up the number on the screen to order. Now, their computer actually changed the wording. So instead of saying please call, they said if operators are busy, please call again. So what does this do? It implies that there is so much demand for the product, the phone lines can actually be busy. So even if it is not really busy, the fact that they say it is, that kind of influences your decision making. That gives you a pause to think that, hey, if the lines are busy, that means a lot of people must be calling. That means in general, people believe that this is a good product, so maybe I should order it too. Again, something that is influenced by phishers. An email says that how many of your colleagues have actually done something, and basically that means you should do it too. So an email says, okay, X of Y employees have updated their operating systems. Click this link to download. So the recipient believes, okay, my colleagues have actually done this, so this seems legitimate, right? Therefore, I should do it too, otherwise I'm missing out, right? And that's why, and I love this meme particularly. I'll tell you when to patch right meow. So obviously not a patching email or it's obviously not a patching link or anything. It's a malicious link, or it can be a malicious attachment that you're asked to download, and that can um, really screw up your systems, your computers. Principle 6, liking. So this is our favorite set of friends, and what this principle says is people make requests to people they like, right? And of course, if that person likes you back, the likelihood of that person saying yes to that request is higher. And at the same time, if you think about it from the opposite direction, if somebody wants to be liked, they are more likely to say yes. And again, there's something that we definitely practice in real life. Normally, your significant other will ask you for a bigger favor than your colleague. I'm sure there may be like variances depending on how well you like or your spouse likes you compared to your colleague, but this is kind of a general fact of life. And again, example how this is used in phishing. So an email from HR, and again it is obviously not from HR, but it asks a new employee who's eager to be liked for confidential information, right? As I mentioned, that if somebody is eager to be liked, they're more likely to respond positively to a request. So an email which says, we don't have your SSN in our records, can you please provide us that info? Normally, if anybody receives an email like this from anybody else, they would really think closely about it, right? Most probably they won't provide that information. But if that person is a new employee and this seems to be coming from HR, they're more likely to say yes. In fact, cyber criminals actually go dumpster diving, right? They look through like discarded materials and trash to determine who the new employees are. So if there's like any kind of printout or anything which says, okay, these people joined on so and so dates, phishing emails would be targeted to those employees because they are new, right? And they are more likely to respond positively to such a request. Now, the final principle, unity. Now, this is something which was not in the original list. He added it later, I think, in the next version of his book, which first came out with these principles. And the idea is that more we identify ourselves with others, the more we are influenced by them. So it has some similarity with liking, but this is more about being part of a group, right? And this is something which politicians use a lot, right? They always want to show themselves as like candidates of the people, right? So they have the same kind of weaknesses, the same kind of faults, right, as the general population. So nowadays, right, they are okay with like admitting to smoking pot, right, and like even like infidelity and all that, because nowadays they kind of endear themselves to the population by saying that, hey, I am a flawed individual, I'm not perfect, but well, so are most of you. That means I'm just one of you, I belong to this wider community. And this was something which is also demonstrated by Dr. Saldini. So he asked his students' parents to complete a questionnaire, right? And the response rate was very, very low. It was like around 20%. But then he offered one extra point. Now, one extra point on a single paper, right, in one semester is pretty much nothing as far as like its impact on the overall grade point average. But just because they are, I mean, the parents and the students, they're obviously part of the family, right? And you want to kind of help out your family members, you're part of that same group. Just because of that one single point that he offered, the response rate jumped to 97%. And again, this is something which is exploited by phishers. An email which basically tries to show that the sender and the receiver have a common interest, right? So basically they're part of that same larger community. So an email which says, as a fellow cat lover, can you please sign this petition? And the signing, the link for that is is obviously not legitimate, it's a phishing link. So again, these are the 7 principles of influence, and phishers exploit them, and that is all about the psychology of the fish. The next section is all about protecting against phishing. And before going into the specific tools and technologies and processes, I would first like to take a moment to discuss the castle approach. So the castle approach, also known as defense in depth, right? And it's called castle approach because this is something which was implemented in castles. And the idea is to have this different concentric layers of security. In other words, if an attacker would be able to breach an outer layer, hopefully an inner layer will be able to block them. So in castles, that would be like outer walls, the moat, inner walls, watchtowers, guards, right? Now today, I think CISOs are kind of the lords of the castle, and the castle here is obviously the modern organization, the modern enterprise, and the treasure here is data, right? Sensitive, confidential data. And here, defense in depth is implemented through these layers of administrative, physical, and technical security. Administrative are all about the rules, right? The policies, procedures, etc., and of course, training. Physical security is anything related to something that can be physically touched. So, like doors, right? Fences, alarms, cameras. And technical security are all the hardware and software security controls. Now, with technical controls around phishing, and I'm not going to read through this the entire content. There are actually a lot of technical controls, and they're pretty good, right? So you have spam filtering, which filters out emails based on specific criteria such as particular keywords or blacklisted URLs. It also kind of there's a way to kind of check that email to see if it is a part of a mass emailing campaign, and that can be indicators of a phish. So that is one way. Then you have IP blacklisting, which blocks emails originating from specific IPs or IP ranges. So this can be like some things like blacklisted IPs that are known to be used by phishers, or they can also be like wide IP ranges, such as maybe used in North Korea. Then you have web proxy. So web proxy doesn't block the phishing emails themselves, but actually blocks access to the phishing sites. So if you click on that link, uh, your ability to kind of go to that phishing site would be restricted because of the use of web proxy. Also, web proxy also kind of run any executable content in a sandbox environment, so they are not run on that user's browser, which also helps keep them secure. So these are some of the technical controls. There are a few more. Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. This is authentication mechanism to detect if the sender's email address has been forged. So it looks like it's coming from Amazon.com, but with this control, you can actually detect that it is not so. Similarly, DKIM, it's an additional authentication method which extends SPF. And then you have DMARC, domain-based method authentication reporting and conformance, which is again an extension of SPF, and DKIM. So all of these are really good. And in my experience as a security consultant, I've seen a lot of organizations actually enable these, right? But even after that, they're still getting phished. And why is that? And that is because, as Bruce Schneier, and he's a well known cryptographer, he puts it very eloquently: amateurs hack systems, professionals hack people. In other words, with all the tools and technologies, you still have human error. I absolutely love this cartoon. I have used it in a number of my presentations. And if there are any Daves in the audience, apologies for that, because that's what this person committing the human error is called. But I think this is symptomatic of pretty much every organization, that even with a lot of tools and technologies, you cannot completely eliminate human error. What you can do is definitely reduce it. And the way to do that is through increased security awareness. So, a lot of you may be familiar with this phrase: I hear, I know, I see, I remember, I do, I understand. In other words, if you actually fall victim to phishing, that's a great lesson. But obviously, we don't want that, right? We want people to learn without actually falling victim. And the best way to do that is through use of phishing simulations. This is where the security team kind of sends out mock phishing emails and see if people actually click on them. And if they do, they are provided remedial training. And the idea is that when these phishing simulations are conducted over a period of time, the number of people who are clicking on these links would trend lower. In other words, the click-through rates would gradually go down, right? Because hopefully people are learning from this experience. Of course, this phishing simulation exercises shouldn't be conducted at regular intervals. For example, if security sends out a mock phishing email on the second Monday of every month, there's a pattern here, right? People would automatically recognize this pattern, and then they would be wary. They would recognize it as a mock phishing email. And so obviously the lessons learned would be less. So the idea is that phishing simulations should be conducted, but irregularly, and they should leverage one or more of the principles of influence, the 7 principles of influence that I went through earlier. And of course, anybody who clicks should be required to take additional training. Now, there are also some common indicators, right, which indicates phishing. For example, the uppercase I for India, it displays as lowercase l if you're using a sans serif font. Now, you can try it out yourselves, right? If you write something in the Arial font, right, the capital I and the lowercase l, the uppercase I and the lowercase l, they look exactly the same, right? And there are also some Unicode characters which resemble ASCII characters. In other words, it may seem like google.com, on that phishing email, but that O may be something else. I mean, very simple, that O may be actually be a zero, right? But there are more sophisticated interpretations of this, right? If they're using different alphabets, right? Not English alphabet, if they're using like Unicode characters. So there may be something which closely resembles the letter O, but it is not O. So obviously, the way to kind of detect it is not just click on link, but actually visit that particular address, type the address directly in your browser. And a lot of these browsers actually nowadays automatically address this. So one thing that security should always do is ensure that only latest browser versions are allowed, right? So ideally, shouldn't be nobody in the organization should be using like an ancient version of Internet Explorer to browse the web. In general, people should distrust and verify, right? In other words, if something seems too good to be true, like most things in life, then it probably is. And that goes for phishing as well. Now, in this section, I want to talk about a few anecdotes and lessons learned. And here I would like to start by quoting this great philosopher of our times, Kanye West. Now he's called Ye, right? Or E, however that is spelled. I believe he changed his name officially. And he once said, I was never really good at anything except for the ability to learn. So here are some lessons learned. So this one was actually at a client, and what we saw was like executives, right? They are often not tech savvy, but they have the most privileged access. They kind of have the keys to the kingdom. And that's why fishers specifically target them. In fact, there is a term for this, right? Phishing specifically targeting executives, that is called whaling. I mean, as you know, like the word phishing, PHI, it actually comes from phishing, FISH, phishing for information. So I think whaling is used because it is kind of the largest fish. But technically, it is not a fish, right? Whales are mammals, but you get the general idea. In fact, in casinos, right, in Las Vegas, for example, the people who bet more than $1 million, they are called whales. In fact, they are the most attractive targets. So same is the case with fishing. The second example, also seen at a client, and this is that business email compromise that I mentioned, that an email from the CEO to accounts payable asking for a payment to be made quickly, and that payment was made, and obviously that was a fraudulent payment. So what's the lesson learned here? The lesson is that external payments should always be verified, but the verification should be using a different channel. In other words, let's say an email comes with a request, and the person who receives it asks for verification via email. Then the attacker can just like repeat their earlier request, right? Because they already have access to that email. So in this case, if the original request came via email, the verification should happen via phone call or maybe like a Teams chat, right? Some internal communication mechanism, but it should be a different channel because the likelihood of an attacker getting access to both is less. Finally, this one, the third incident is actually something that I encountered myself. So I received an email and I checked it on my phone, and it seemed to be coming from Craigslist. And this happened after I posted something on Craigslist, right? So obviously somebody saw that, and that's why I was targeted. And the symbol that you see on the left, that Craigslist logo, which I think is also the peace symbol. Anyway, so this email said that your account has been hacked. Please please change your password. And I stupidly clicked on the link. But thankfully, I am a security professional, so something clicked in my brain, and I took a closer look, and I saw that email obviously was not from Craigslist. So the lesson to be learned here is that security professionals, obviously, we are not immune to phishing, so we should be careful as well. And another lesson I learned personally is that if I'm looking at things on a phone, right, the screen is much smaller than my laptop. So it is less likely that I will look at things closely. So that level of scrutiny is less if the screen size is smaller. So again, something I think all of you can learn from. In conclusion, and I'm at the end of my presentation. If you are part of the security team who's running this phishing simulations, and you don't see that the click-through rates are actually trending downwards, that is a red flag. That means people are not learning, right? So you should be very vocal about it. The second one, I've seen this in some places, that executives are falling. They are repeatedly clicking on this mock phishing links, right? And they feel kind of embarrassed and said that no, please excuse me, please remove me from the next exercise. And just because they're execs, they feel they can say that. But as an information security professional, you should push back, right? Because of two reasons. One is executives are actually targeted more, right? And if they're compromised, the harm to the organization will be more than, let's say, like an ordinary employee being compromised. And secondly, and executives may not actually like hearing this, a lot of executives, like who are non-tech executives, they are often not so tech savvy as they believe themselves to be. So this is another thing I think you should be cognizant of. And finally, even with all the tools, technologies, even with all the knowledge, there's something you cannot eliminate, and that is confirmation bias, right? If you are checking your own work, that's a conflict of interest. So in this case, it does make sense to bring in an external expert. And obviously, this is how guys like us, security consultants, make money. But it does make sense to have that external expert come in, ask the tough questions, basically play the devil's advocate. So my final word to you is, and I'm quoting perhaps a very influential philosopher at times, Dilbert, or rather his creator Scott Adams, and he once wrote, "You don't have to be a person of influence to be influential. In fact, the most influential people in my life are probably not even aware of the things they've taught me." I hope that this presentation has been somewhat influential to you. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.